the dying days of the Orichin, with forums and promenades still blood-wet from Tenno betrayal, a colossal sentient descended upon ancient Ur, falling from distant stars to deliver upon Orichin a terrible and final ruin. Tower upon tower fell to its weapons, but one withstood, the Tower of the Unum. The Tenno scattered, but one remained, Gara, she and the Unum, inseparable. The Unum, lodestone of our people, and subject of 100 stories herself. The sentient was a deformed creature, twisted and massive, sent from some dark fold of distant space, a warped thing wounded by daylight. By night it was a terror, felling tower after tower, citadel after citadel. But by day it hid, blinded and pained. It was during the day that Gara roamed, yearning to strike it from creation while it cowered, weakened and blind, to safeguard her beloved Unum. But never could Gara find it. By night the sentient was abroad, its titanic mass casting a terrible shadow across the land, the mass of it railing against the walls of the tower, yet kept at bay by the exertion of the Unum's colossal will and the sacrifice of her faithful. But such exertions could not be maintained forever. Gara yearned to strike out, to lash and tear at the monstrosity that threatened her love, but the Unum forbade it. At night the sentient was at the height of its power, and Gara's light would make her the most tempting of targets to a creature of such profound darkness. Gara's death would be certain. No, a different strategy was required. The sentient prowled and pressed and failed, never risking too much, for the sentient could not reproduce. What it lost forever. It had killed many cities before, felled many towers, but this little one prevailed. Why, it pondered in many voices, was that? The Unum knew she could not defend forever, nor could her faithful throw their bodies against the sentient in perpetuity. So she gave her followers some of her blood, her refined temple kuva, and they in turn gave it to the animals of the land. And the animals became an extension of her, and she became an extension of them. And the animals roamed and searched, and they found where the sentient chose to hide itself. The sentient sensed this subterfuge, and capturing one of the Unum's animals, opened it up for examination. And what little of the Unum that was present there lit the sentient's mind like the dark star from which it had fallen. The sentient, you see, could not procreate, but in the temple kuva, it tasted healing, completeness, a future. It devoured each and every last Unum animal, but it was not enough. The sentient turned its hundreds of eyes toward the tower with new understanding. It would not destroy the tower. It would become the tower. It would kill the Unum, take her place, and one with that healing palace give birth to a race of itself. Gara and Unum knew where the sentient was. The sentient knew the tower was the future of its race. The sentient threw itself at the tower, no longer cautious, taking great losses and knowing the prize was worthy of it. Should it succeed, all losses would be replaced 1,000-fold. This is when, across the plains, the great pylons ignited for the first time. Sheets of energy sprung up between them, powered by the will of the Unum at their epicenter, trapping the monstrosity within. Loyal Gara, unwilling to heed inaction any longer, broke from the side of the Unum and flew out at night, her eyes on the sentient mind. The sentient, torn between its most coveted prize and the mortal threat, broke from the tower and turned back on itself to defend itself from noble Gara. But Gara's eyes were not for the sentient, but for the glittering man-sized device resting just beyond the gates. It had not been there before, but it was there now. It swatted Gara from the sky, drew it to herself, meaning to end her life there and then. The battle was terrible. Gara sustained injuries she would not survive. But in her final moments, brave Gara seized upon the device her beloved Unum had crafted, seized it to her breast, and allowed the sentient to draw her in one final time. Toward its body, toward its core, toward the seat of its intelligence. From within, the sentient unfurled myriad feelers, probes, tendrils, viciously toothed and made for killing. They swept toward Gara violently, and the glass warrior made no defense. Her defense was her final attack. The device detonated, and the Unum cried out as night lit as day. The battle, the terror, was ended. The tower wall shook. The sentient's body shuddered, racked by a cacophonous energy. Forests fell as piece after piece, giant body after giant body, crashed to the plains and marshes and flatlands. Animals fled in spreading waves from pounding sky-high walls of dust, angered and whipped to fury by the death of a god. The last of Gara's energy arced from body to body, machine to machine, piece to piece, a horizon-wide applause of light, beautiful and terrible. And then, silence. All was still. The Unum's adherents wandered through the haze, calling for one another, lost in a miasma. Husbands seizing onto wives, children onto parents. It was over. Gara was never seen again. The sentients then became as they are now, senseless, wandering, yearning for a unity they sense more than they remember. And the Unum? The Unum survived, alone, for centuries. Until today, when you stand here, reading this. This is Onkko, Sita's archivist, with my translation of the Gara Legend.
Hi guys, my name's Subtutor, I'm the Man on Silver Mountain, welcome back. Now, as you probably guessed from the run of those recordings, those transmissions beforehand, we're going to be talking about the Gara Legend today for our Warframe lore video, and it's going to be going through those transmissions, which, due to the fact that I'm a little short on time this week and I've kind of been all over the place, I'm going to go through the written entries on the wiki, even though we've just gone through the recordings as one kind of stream in the game there. So you have to bear with me on this a little bit, but there you go. In which case, though, let's get into it, because we've got a whole load of information here about the Unum, and I want to do next week. I'm going to look at the planes of Eidolon, the kind of Cetus fragments with their Onkko transmissions in the background as well, because between this stuff here as well as the stuff that comes from the other one, we've got this whole load of weird information to kind of pick through, some of which is, oh, this is somewhat factually presented, and other stuff that is very story based, and I don't mean the Warframe story based, I mean it's word of mouth, legend story, stuff like that. So anyway, let's start at the beginning. So the first thing to take from this is the time period that the events that transpired before the Eidolon was left, or Eidolons I suppose, were left plaguing the plains, is kind of important and is spelled out for us right here, because it's Onkko tells us that in the dying days of the Orokin, with forums and promenades still blood wet from Tenno betrayal, so a colossal sentient descended upon ancient seemingly being just a mispronunciation of Earth generally, and we'll see this again, especially in some of the stuff that happens in the other stuff, the hidden transmissions in the plains of Eidolon and kind of Cetus fragments as well, the 1,000-year fish. But here, we know that the Orokin, kind of the leadership, the Seven, the Emperors, whoever, called a large celebration at the fact that that the Tenno rather had defeated the Sentients, driven them out of the Origin system, essentially won the war to one extent or another, seemingly. And that's when the Tenno, possibly just the Warframes, still up in the air about that, attacked and wiped them out. In which case, the thing that stands out here is that this is all happening post attack and disruption of the Orokin leadership, and potentially the attack of this sentient dropping out of the void, which it seems to have travelled through, to go and do all of this damage, might have been one of the main reasons why the collapse happened. Because we've been talking about the collapse and how possibly it seems really odd that no one stood up and kind of just took over from within the vacuum that was caused. Possibly we've talked about in the past about how that could very well be related to just the executors, the emperors, the Sectaris class being the only people that had kind of a full access to all functions of Orokin tech within their caste-based society. And so potentially there just weren't enough people with a high enough clearance to then keep the wheels turning, if you like. But it could also be that this sentient's appearance is something that then made it worse. And we kind of see this as we go forward. So he's saying that tower upon tower fell to the sentient, apart from the Unum, and with the Tenno scattered, only one remained. Now, whether or not this is the Gara Warframe acting like the Sylvanas Warframe, the Titania Warframe with Sylvanas, whether or not it's the Warframe acting independently and it's being cast as a Tenno because no one knew better, or whether it is still a Tenno that didn't heed Lotus's instructions to go to sleep. Whether it's one way or the other, we still have Gara kicking around. But she stayed with the Unum, and the Unum was the lodestone of their people, and this apparently this is already a time at which these individuals, the Ostrons, had already settled here, and we'll see more of that later on, because it says that the Unum here was the lodestone of their people, still is, and subject to 100 stories of her own, which we will go into later on. But the sentient was a deformed creature, twisted and massive, sent from some dark fold in distant space, a warped thing wounded by daylight. Now, we've met a couple of other sentients so far. We've met Natar, and we've met Hunhao. And Hunhao seems pretty badly beaten up, but he doesn't. He does, and that seems to be because he sacrificed himself. But he doesn't seem kind of horribly undone. He doesn't necessarily seem harmed by sunlight or anything else like that, because you would have thought that would extend, as we see with the Eidolon, from what we observe. The Eidolons only come out at night because they're still vulnerable. The Vombalists, again, also only come out at night to support the Eidolons and the kind of remnant of this sentient. And yet we don't see that in regards to the various sentient units that are sent by Hunhao. They still seem fully functional, fully operable, and they seem the way that this has just kind of come through after the end of the fight. It seems like maybe it was being beaten somewhere else. Last ditch effort to just come and just wipe out what was left. Very possibly unplanned. And it seems to have jumped through the void, but it maybe has spent more time in the void than the others did. maybe it just wasn't prepared for it, whatever, because we've got Lotus that seemingly just transmuted into something different, or rather Natar that transmuted into something different. We've got Hunhao who deliberately sacrificed himself with an aim of kind of resurging at a later date to finish off what was left. But here we've got one that seems to have taken substantial damage. And the one thing that we know that kind of really damages the sentience is kind of our operator's void powers. And I'm wondering if, when it now, the later part of this, where it says that it was wounded by daylight, I have to wonder if maybe there are common elements between the kind of cosmic radiation, UV light, whatever else that's thrown off by the sun, and what we can channel through ourselves in terms of the void energy. You know, maybe there's just some close comparison or something very similar in the way that those two sources, those two energies, those two forms of, radiation interact with their environments. But then anyway, it says by night it went and felled towers, took out citadels, but by day it hid. And you know, Gara would roam, and it would try and hunt out the weakened and blinded like sentient individual to try and just, you know, win, but couldn't find it. Now, one of the things that stands out to me about that is that we see off in the distance in various directions large parts of sentient ships and stuff like that around the plains of Eidolon. And so I'm thinking, you know, we've got this huge seeming deep sea like around one edge of the map. Could it be that it just dived down to the depths? Because as we've seen with Hunhao, being right at the bottom of a deep sea doesn't seem to phase a sentient. The room in which the Stalker meets Hunhao is dry, pressurized seemingly to one extent or another, has some form of life support because the Stalker doesn't seem fussed by being there at all. And unless there's something very strange about the Stalker that we're still not aware of yet, it has no reason not to be governed by the same rules that we are and our Warframes are. So, you know, we've got this interesting thing where we can go, yeah, okay, it's probably hidden in the water. But anyway, by night the Sentient was abroad, its titanic mass casting terrible shadow across the land, mass of it railing against the walls of the tower, yet kept at bay by the exertion of the Unum's colossal will and the sacrifice of her faithful. So, seemingly, even though this sentient was potentially able to fly, because it may very well have had flight capabilities, considering it's travelled across the huge distances of space to get here, it's probably got a fair number of its own kind of drone fighters and things like that we've seen from others. It's more cautious about losing them, and yet it's the Unum's colossal will, whatever that could mean, and the sacrifice of her faithful. So the people who were actually the Quills, the Ostrons, the people who were already settled there, they were actively fighting against the Sentients, and seemingly because they were damaged in a more weakened state, they may very well have been holding their ground, and the fact that Gara was there probably didn't hurt. But as it says here, such exertions couldn't be maintained forever. Gara yearned to actually go and deal with it, but the Unum said no. And that could be because as we've seen with the way that Onkko speaks to us, the Unum seems to be able to process possible futures. So it probably has an idea of where it needs to go, what it needs to do, and it needs Gara to do it. But then it's at night the Sentient was at the height of its power, which could very well still have been much lesser than the power of a fully whole sentient. But Gara's light would make the most tempting target to a creature of such profound darkness, i.e. largest threat, going to take her out. And Gara's death would be certain, and so the Unum is looking for a different strategy. Again, I feel like that could very well be that it has already processed the Unum, whatever the Unum is in connection to the tower. The processing power therein seems to be substantial enough to tell possible futures and interact on a grander scale. And I want to do, the reason I'm doing these videos now is because I want to go into a speculation video on that, because I think I've got an interesting idea that I've not heard from anyone else yet. Anyway, moving on. The sentient prowled and pressed and failed, never risking too much, for the sentient could not reproduce. In other words, yeah, it couldn't repair itself, it couldn't divide and generate more troops, like Hunhow, where Hunhow has been kind of cagey and kind of reserved about just attacking us in full force. It's not that surprising, because they can't reproduce, they can't make more of themselves. There's a reason why Hunhow looked to employ the Stalker to try and take us on, rather than sending its own troops. You know, it didn't have that... it doesn't have that many additional troops to fling at us to lose. You know, if it ends up expending all of its troops, all of its resources on us, so that it is just it by itself, Hunhow, at the bottom of the ocean on Uranus, then it has no other recourse. You know, it's just stuck there as a voice. But then it says that yes, it killed many cities and towers and things like that, but this little tower, this one stood out by itself. It didn't fall, and it ponders to why this is. In many voices, again, it's got its own array of facets of itself in different forms, but you've got the interesting thing here where the Unum then gives her followers her blood, and this is again where we see a direct reference between blood and Kuva, and it says her refined temple Kuva, and then in turn they gave it to the animals of the land, and the animals became an extension of her, and she became an extension of them, and the animals roamed and searched, and they found where the sentient chose to hide itself. So this is interesting, because we see this is how I feel Onkko is connected. So the Unum provided Temple Kuva, and it, through whatever kind of connection it could forge, it allowed access to the vast repository of computing power it seems to have for use, which again may be why the Ostrons generally are so unbothered by things and so calm, even though you've got the horrors outside, because the tower is calm and the tower is being direct. You've got Onkko, who's maybe taken in more of the Kuva, and it's not just a hereditary adaptation from ingesting it prior, it's something that has been taken more recently, and Onkko is literally talking to us from the perspective of seeing multiple pasts and multiple presents and multiple futures. And I feel like that's a result of being connected to the huge computational power of the Unum. But then again, also using that kind of connection to deal with a huge number of other animals roaming around, which again, they found where the sentient chose to hide. Could very well have been fish that were the spies that found it. But it's interesting to note that this isn't the only person the only individual kind of character that we see attaching itself to many, many others outside itself. We've got us as the Warframes taking things over, taking over the Warframes rather as Tenno. We've got the sentients generally, who are individuals that then have multiple proxies attached to themselves that do their bidding, and yet each operate still on an independent basis. And then you've got Lotus, who has been able to directly interact with us through somatic link, who has been able to kind of seemingly network and work between all of the different Tenno. Now, the one thing that stands out here is that, and possibly also just as a point, something I mentioned before, which was speculation, and still may be speculation, but is the fact that we don't know if it was the Warframes acting on their own, or if it was the Tenno acting, or if it was the Warframes acting under Lotus's direct control that ended the Orokin. Like, that's still up in the air, and it probably will be for quite some time, even with quests like the Sacrifice and whatever else coming out at some point in the future. So we've got all of those things to consider here, but the thing that stands out is that with the exception of the Tenno, who are given this ability by the Void, all of the others that we see controlling these groups are sentients, essentially, because the other hive mind that's still around is the infestation, but that's more of a continuous piece of biomass that has lots of little specializations and other bits and pieces. It's not an individual controlling everything, it's everything becoming an individual, so it's a slight difference. But yeah, moving on, because we've only got a couple of these left. The Sentients sensed this subterfuge, capturing the Unum's animals, opened it up for examination, and it found what was there. And the Sentient that couldn't procreate suddenly seemed to find that this was healing to one extent or another. And now this is where I feel that the Unum, the tower, is essentially sentient to one degree or another in construction. And I'll go into this, as said, in another video once I've been through this and the other one. But again, what would provide a damaged sentient a new lease on life? Materials from another sentient that hadn't had those qualities removed. It would be like kind of stem cell treatment in humans or in lab animals. It's that, or bone marrow transplants and various other transplants that we do in the real world. It would be this transplantation of active, vital, living tissue of some description, living material that is useful and that needs to be replaced in the injured individual, being replaced, being removed, being sorted out. And as a result, though, this sentient goes nuts on it. And it goes, right, okay, that tower, I need to take the tower. The tower is what I need. I need all of it that's there. And it says it would kill the Unum, take her place, and one with that healing palace give birth to a race of itself. So yeah, it's the tower that provides the healing and everything else, and as a result, it's something that they need. It's something that it needs to go and take away from whoever the Unum is. Now, I'm wondering if the Unum is either some kind of Lorist or some kind of Archimedean or whatever else from Orokin times that was placed there, or possibly would even be a repurposed Tenno, maybe one that just couldn't operate with the Warframes for whatever reason. Maybe one whose void gifts were more high functioning and computational rather than projective, and as a result was attached to the tower instead for whatever reason. Who knows? But the sentient wants it, and it as a result, it's no longer cautious. It's got nothing to lose, because if it wins, then it gets everything back. And it's a bit of a problem for it. Now, this is something that stands out to me in this next section, where it says, this is when across the plains the great pylons ignited for the first time. Sheets of energy sprung between them, powered by the will of the Unum at their epicenter, trapping the monstrosity within. Now, if it can move across land, fine. We've seen that the sentients generally can hover somewhat, sure, but this thing would have, to cover the whole surface of Earth and just wipe out certain towers and citadels along the way, of which I assume there'll be a fair number, it's going to have to move a significant distance at a reasonable speed. If it's fallen from space as a result of passing through the void and whatever else, you can imagine that it's probably got capabilities for flight. Now, even with the barriers up around the plains of Eidolon, the unfortunate thing is that we've not seen, or rather, we have seen Grineer dropships and things just, jumping in and dropping people off. There is no roof to the dome, in which case I don't understand necessarily how the pylons, those shields, those barriers just kept the Eidolon in place. I mean, arguably it might not have wanted to go anywhere because it was attacking the wall in the first place, but it's made sure that it's less open and all the rest of it. And the other thing, I suppose, to take away from that is maybe it was a way for it to not retreat back into the sea, maybe. Although then again, also, if it could get into the sea, why wouldn't it attack the Unum from the water, where the sun would be less harmful to it? Who knows? But it's an interesting set of things to talk around. But then Gara, unwilling to listen to the Unum's suggestions that she needed to stay put, broke lines and went straight for the core of the Sentient. And now this last bit is a long one, but there's a decent amount of information in here as well. So the Sentient, torn between its coveted prize and mortal threat, which seems to again be the Gara was just a Tenno, a Warframe, whichever one, and potentially, if it sees it as a mortal threat, it means it's familiar with Tenno and Warframes. It means it's familiar with the damage they've done. Potentially, it's suffered a decent amount of its damage from them. And so, as a result, yeah, it's coming back to that initial fight that happened before this Sentient even got to the Origin system. But then it says that there's a glittering man-sized device resting in just beyond the gates. It had not been there before, but it was there now. And it's interesting to think that possibly the Unum has the capacity to create things, teleport things, move things on the planes and stuff within its influence that we've just not seen yet. Because the other thing is, I've heard people suggest that maybe the man-sized device is kind of like the Hun Hao that we see, where it's just this black figure that still seems humanoid. And I don't think so, because the device detonates later on in this section, as we heard being discussed earlier. And so I think it's just a particularly well-designed bomb for Gara to use. It's this thing that has been placed before her. I feel like the Unum has been planning and preparing for this moment, knowing when Gara is likely to break away from her, and now it's giving her the weapon, the tools that she needs to get the job done effectively. But yeah, it again, it even says that the device her beloved Unum had crafted, so it is a thing that was presented, and it destroys it, and the tower wall shook. The sentient body shuddered, cracking by a cacophonous by a cacophonous energy. Forests fell as piece after piece of the giant body after giant body crashed into the plains, suggesting again that it might have been one of those multi-segmented kind of serpent ship suggestions that we've heard tell of before. But it falls to pieces section by section, crashing. The animals fled, spreading waves from pounding sky-high walls of dust. And it's like you've had this cataclysm happen, but it worked. And you had the people, the Ostrons, kind of gathering together, looking after each other in the aftermath. But Gara was gone. Gara was blown up, and and now you've got this sentient that is in so many different fragments, blown to pieces, its cognitive processes disrupted, and that's how it's remaining kind of active on the planes as it seeks out further kind of renewal and the feeling of what it once was, because it's suggested elsewhere that we went over before that it probably can't remember what it was specifically. But anyway, guys, I'd love to again hear your thoughts. There have been some great comments. I'm sorry I haven't actually got back to them recently. As said, I've been very busy. This is why I'm doing it just on a browser page here rather than staying in game with it. But it's the comments I'll get to, the comments that have been left on some of the Warframe lore videos recently have been great and stuff, so thank you very much for those. And otherwise, I will see you guys in the video next week, or tomorrow. No, video tomorrow. This isn't a Friday video, it's a Thursday video. I'm losing track. As said, long week. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, found it interesting, please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more. And I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.